For 15 years, Marcus Vail refused every woman who came near him. Not because he could not have them, because he had made a decision, one quiet, final decision the day the woman he loved disappeared without a word. He locked the door. He threw away the key. And for 15 years, nobody came close. Until one afternoon, Leon placed a surveillance photo on his desk. A routine report. A woman sitting in a coffee shop window. She was not looking at the camera. She did not know it was there. She was just thinking. Marcus looked at that photograph, and something he had kept locked for 15 years cracked open. He said 4 words, not what Leon expected, not what anyone expected. He said, "Bring her to me." What happened next was not a love story. It was something more dangerous than that, because the woman in the photograph was about to discover that the man who sent for her was being slowly poisoned by the one person he trusted most. And she was the only one in the world who held the piece of truth that could unravel 15 years of silence. This channel exists because some people are born to lead, and the lessons that come with that kind of life are never taught in any classroom. Only the ones who have sat in the hardest rooms, made the heaviest decisions, and paid the real price of power ever learn them. This is not a channel about crime. This is a channel about mindset, about backbone, and about the secrets behind what real power actually looks like. The lesson this story carries is one that most people only learn when it is too late. The most dangerous person in your life is never your obvious enemy. It is the person you stopped questioning a long time ago because they were always there. Information is not the same as truth. And the distance between those two things can cost you 15 years. If that hit something in you, stay with us. Drop a comment and tell us which moment got you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Like if you want more stories that take you seriously. And subscribe, because there are more rooms like this one waiting, and we will take you inside every single one.
People say a lot of things about Marcus Vail, that he controls more than 40 factories across Michigan without signing a single illegal contract, that he remembers the name of every person who has ever sat across from him in 20 years of doing business, that in a room full of people, he is the one who talks the least and decides the most. But the thing people talk about more than any of that, the thing that Detroit finds more remarkable than the empire he built, is that Marcus Vail does not have a woman. Not cannot, not will not, does not allow it. 15 years. Not one person has made it past the first conversation. Not one person has been invited back a second time. People have given this all kinds of names over the years. Cold, arrogant, already taken by someone nobody has ever seen. None of them are right. The truth is simpler than all of those guesses, and harder. Marcus Vail loved someone once. She disappeared, and he decided that was the last time. It is 5:47 in the morning. The city of Detroit is just beginning to wake up below him. From the 22nd floor of a building, with no sign on the door, the kind of building that does not want anyone looking too closely, Mark stands at the floor-to-ceiling window with a coffee cup in one hand and his other hand in his jacket pocket. His thumb is turning something small over and over inside that pocket. He does not take it out. The coffee cup has been in his hand for 11 minutes. He has not taken a single sip. The narrator's voice comes in quiet and even, the way a man speaks when he has already lived the story he is about to tell. A man who controls a city learns 2 things early: what everyone else is afraid of, and how to make sure they never find out what he is afraid of. I have known the first list for 20 years. The second list has exactly 1 item on it, and for the last 8 months, that item has been getting harder to keep off the radar. He finally takes the hand out of his pocket. In his palm is a small white pill sealed in a tiny plastic bag with a zip closure. Not a prescription bottle, not a labeled container, just the pill in the bag, the way a man carries something when he does not want anyone to ask questions about it. He looks at it, he puts it back. He still does not drink the coffee. By 7:30 that morning, Marcus is at the head of the conference room table on the 18th floor. 6 people sit around him, all experienced, all older, in their respective fields. But when Marcus walked in, every conversation stopped until he sat down. Not because they are afraid of him exactly, because of something older and more specific than fear. Respect that was earned over a long time in difficult rooms. He runs the meeting about a new union contract at the East Side Steel plant. 3 decisions are needed. He resolves all 3 in 11 minutes. He does not raise his voice once. He does not interrupt anyone. Twice, he turns a question back on the person who brought it, not to challenge them, but to make sure they fully understand what they are recommending. This is how Marcus Vale has always run things, precisely, quietly, with complete attention, and almost no one in that room notices the 3 things that happen in the background of that perfectly controlled meeting. The first thing, before the meeting begins, a man named Leon enters with Marcus and sets a small pale blue personal water bottle on the table beside Marcus's right hand. Leon is 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with close cropped silver hair. He does this the same way every morning, the same way for 20 years, the way you set out a pen for someone before a meeting. Neither of them acknowledges it. It takes 4 seconds. Nobody else looks. The second thing, somewhere around the 40-second mark of a long quarterly report, both of Marcus's hands are flat on the table. His left hand begins to tremble. Not much, just enough for him to feel it. He places his right hand gently over it, the way a man might lace his fingers when he is thinking deeply. It looks natural. Nobody notices. The third thing, after the meeting ends and everyone else has left, Marcus sits alone in the glass conference room. He looks at his left hand. He turns it over. The trembling continues for about 8 seconds and then stops. He studies his own hand not with fear, but with the precise, flat attention of someone reading data. 8 months of this. 8 months of watching his own left hand, like it is a report he does not like the numbers in. Every morning, he can still give the orders, still hold the room, still be the last person anyone wants to argue with in Southeast Michigan. Just cannot keep his left hand still for 8 seconds. Leon comes back after everyone's has cleared out. He does not knock. He has not knocked in 20 years. He places a fresh water bottle on the desk, the old one still almost full. But this is the routine. Twice a day, and the routine does not change. He gives a short briefing. A few minor issues at the Northgate plant. A contract that needs a resignature. And then, last mentioned last, the way important things are sometimes mentioned last so they sound less important than they are. Leon says, Greystone Industrial is having a problem with an independent auditor. Someone named Sonia Cross. I will handle it. Marcus does not look up from the file he is reading. Handle it quietly. Always, Leon says. He leaves. Marcus looks at the water bottle on his desk. Not the way you look at a water bottle. He picks it up, drinks a long sip, goes back to the file. He does not think about Leon's footsteps fading down the hallway. He does not think about the water he just swallowed. He has been doing this for 8 months and the thinking does not help, so he has stopped doing it. At 10:30 that same morning, in a rented office on the 7th floor of an ordinary building across town, a woman named Sonia Cross opens a file on her second monitor. Her workspace is small and functional. 2 monitors, 3 stacks of physical files with colored tabs, a whiteboard covered in notations that would look like noise to anyone who was not Sonia. A coffee cup she has already forgotten is cold. No personal photos on the desk. She was asked about that once by a client who found the absence strange. She told him, I do not want anyone reading my life while I am reading their numbers. She opens the first spreadsheet from her newest contract. Client name, Greystone Industrial. Machine parts manufacturer in the suburbs of Detroit. 6-week standard audit engagement, standard fee. She opens the first financial spreadsheet. She works through the first 46 rows without stopping. The 47th number does not match its counterpart in the next column. A discrepancy of $14,000 on a transaction worth $2.3 million. A variance of 0.6%. Most auditors would flag it and come back to it later. Sonia opens 3 more spreadsheets to find out where the $14,000 went. Not because the amount is significant, because the number does not fit. and a number that does not fit is not an accounting error to her. It is a question, and Sonia Cross does not leave questions unanswered. She thinks to herself, people ask me how I find fraud in companies that have spent years hiding it. The answer is always disappointing. I look for the thing that does not fit, not the big thing, the small thing. The 14,000 in a 3 million transaction. Fraud is patient. I am more patient. She opens the next file. Ordinary work. Ordinary morning. In a building across town, Marcus Vale drinks from a water bottle that is slowly doing something to him that he does not yet know about. In this building, Sonia Cross follows a $14,000 question towards something she does not yet know exists. The last thing a careful man expects is someone more careful than himself. 3 weeks pass. The 14,000 led to 47,000. The 47,000 led to a pattern that Sonia wrote on her whiteboard in capital letters, and then stood back and stared at for a long time. Money from Greystone was flowing into 7 small companies on a 23-day cycle. Not a billing cycle, not a payroll schedule, not a quarterly period. Nothing standard runs on 23 days. These 7 companies were registered in 7 different states over an 18-month window. None of them had a real website. None of them had a phone number that went anywhere. Each had a registered business address and a bank account. This was not crude money laundering. This was architecture. The kind that takes intelligence and patience and real resources to build. The kind that someone designed specifically because it looks like nothing at all, unless you happen to be following a $14,000 question at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She wrote on the whiteboard, 23-day cycle, why 23? Not any standard period, unless the designer chose it deliberately because it matches nothing. That same night, driving home, a charcoal gray sedan pulled out of a parking structure 2 blocks behind her and followed her for 6 lights. She noticed at the second light. She changed her route at the third. By the 5th light, the car was gone. She drove to a grocery store, went in through the front, walked out through a side entrance, caught a cab home, and sat in the back of the cab looking out at the streets of Detroit without saying a word for 12 minutes. She was not panicking. She was thinking. They were not following her to find the documents. The documents were not in her office, not on her work computer, not anywhere a standard search would locate them. They were following her because they wanted her to know she was being watched. Because sometimes the message is not the action. Sometimes the message is the awareness. She activated the system she had built 5 years ago after a different audit that went sideways in a different city. She called it her dead man switch, though that name was always a little dramatic for her taste. The practical description: a package of encrypted files stored in 4 separate locations, set to automatically send to 3 designated people if she did not enter a specific check-in code every 72 hours. The package contained everything she had found on Greystone, every spreadsheet, every company name, every 23-day cycle entry, everything. She adjusted the window down to 72 hours and set the check-in for before she went to sleep. Then she went to sleep. 2 days later, her office was broken into. The lock was not forced. Whoever did it either had a key or had skills with a pick that left no marks. Nothing was taken. Every file was still in its exact place. Her monitors were untouched. But her chair had been moved. She kept her chair at a precise angle to her desk, a habit from years of working in small spaces. She had not moved it. Someone had sat in it, and then tried to put it back, almost exactly right. But not quite. She stood in the middle of the office and looked at the chair for a moment. Then she sat down, reset the check-in timer on her phone, and opened her laptop. She was not going to pretend the break-in had not happened. She was also not going to let it change what she was doing, or how she was doing it. They had come to look. They had not found anything because there was nothing here to find. The most important thing she could do now was continue working accurately and quickly, before anyone decided to escalate from looking to something else. She started in on the second batch of Greystone files. In his office across town, Leon sat down across from a man whose face the audience never quite sees clearly. This was not an unusual arrangement. Leon had meetings like this, in locations like this, for reasons that did not go into any official record. He had been doing it for years, and he was good at it. The man across from him said, "The auditor found the seven-company structure." Leon said, "How much does she understand?" "Enough to be dangerous. Not enough to know who built it. Keep the surveillance on her, physical and digital. I want to know every move she makes in the next 10 days." The man nodded and left. Leon sat alone for a while. He thought about the word dangerous. Then he thought about Greystone. Then he thought about what Marcus would say when he brought him the surveillance file. He pulled out his phone and started building the report. Photos, timeline, risk assessment. Standard format, the same format he had used for 20 years. He went through the photos from the surveillance team, one by one. Most of them were unremarkable. Sonia entering her building, Sonia leaving her building, Sonia at a convenience store, Sonia at a light. He got to the Tuesday afternoon set, a coffee shop near the Greystone offices. She went there every Tuesday. The surveillance photographer had caught her through the window glass from across the street. In the best photo, she was sitting near the window, looking out at the street. One hand holding a pen, a small notebook open on the table in front of her. She did not know the camera was there. She was not performing anything. She was just thinking, whatever that looks like from the outside. Leon looked at the photo for about 2 seconds. He saw an audit risk. He printed it, he clipped it into the report. He printed the full report and put it in a manila folder. He went upstairs and put the folder on Marcus' desk. Marcus was alone in his office when he opened the folder. He read through the report in order. Greystone assessment. Timeline of the auditor's activity. Notes on her methodology. Risk level. Recommended action. He got to the photos. He looked at the first one. Standard identification shot. Full face. Looking at the camera. He looked at it and moved on. Second photo. Exterior shot. Sonia entering the office building. He moved on. Third photo. He stopped. This is the moment. This is the one that the story has been building toward without announcing it. In the photo, a woman is sitting near a coffee shop window, looking out at the street. She is holding a pen. She has a small notebook open in front of her. She does not know the camera is there. She is thinking. The way she is looking out that window, Marx did not move for a long time. He knew who she was not. He was not confused about that, not even for a single second. The woman in the photo was not the woman he had loved. The face was different. The age was different. Everything concrete and specific was different. But the way she was looking out that window focused. Completely still. Like a woman who is in the middle of a conversation with a problem that nobody else has recognized as a problem yet. Diane used to look out of windows exactly that way. He had not thought about that specific thing, that specific quality of attention in a very long time. He had locked the room. He had thrown away the key. He had been careful about it for 15 years, which is a long time to be careful about a single thing, and it had worked. Until this photograph, until this woman he had never met, photographed through glass from across the street, thinking about something he would never know. He sat with the photograph for what felt like a long time, but was probably closer to 30 seconds. Then Leon appeared in the doorway. Leon said, "I can move on the auditor today if you want it resolved before the end of the week." Marcus looked at the photograph one more time, set it down. He said, "Don't handle her. Bring her to me." Leon was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, I want to speak with her directly." "Set it up." Marcus put the folder face down and went back to the document he had been reading before. Leon stood in the doorway for 2 more seconds. Then he left. In 20 years, Marcus had never given that particular order about a woman connected to the organization. Not once. Leon walked back to his own office with the folder under his arm, and something he had not experienced in a very long time. The sensation of not being entirely sure what was going to happen next. 2 days later, in an underground parking structure on the east side of Detroit, Sonia Cross walked toward her car at 8 in the evening and saw 2 men moving toward her from different directions. She saw them at 15 steps. She assessed her exit options. She recognized immediately that this was coordinated. Then a third person stepped out from the shadows near the back wall of the garage. He was tall. He wore a suit that had no wrinkles. His hair was silver-touched and precise. He looked at the two men and said one word, "Stop." Both men stopped moving. So did Sonia. Not because she was frightened exactly, because she recognized something. This was a person whose authority in this particular space was total and unquestioned. One word, and a parking garage listened. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Someone who needs to know what you found." She said, "And if I don't tell you?" He said, "Then I have a problem, and problems in my world have a way of becoming everyone's problem." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "That is the least reassuring thing anyone has said to me all week. And yesterday someone broke into my office." He said, "I know." She said, "You know. My people were watching the people who watched you, not the two men you see right now." She looked at the far corner of the garage, then back at him. "So you have two separate groups following me, one to threaten, one to observe. That is either very organized or very conflicted." He took a card out of his jacket pocket and held it out. "Just a number, no name, no title. Search the number," he said. "Take 20 minutes. Then decide if you want to have a conversation." She looked at the card. She did not take it immediately. "And if I call that number and don't like what I hear, then the conversation is over and I have a different problem to solve." She picked up the card. She walked to her car. She did not look back. Marcus watched her go. Leon on the phone, from somewhere across the garage, said something. Marcus said, "No." He put his phone in his pocket and walked in the other direction. 20 minutes. That was how long Sonia sat in her car in the parking structure before she made her decision. She searched the number on the card. Nothing came up, which was not surprising. She called Kwame, her once trusted contact from his years as a federal investigator. He called her back in 8 minutes. He said, "Marcus Vale. Industrial money in Detroit, the kind that does not show up in the clean column, but also does not show up in the police blotter. Not someone you want as an enemy, but also, and this part matters, not someone known for unnecessary escalation. He solves problems. He doesn't manufacture them." She sat with that for a minute. Then she called the number on the card. A man answered on the second ring. Not Leon. Just a voice that said an address and a time the following morning. She said, "I will be there." She drove home. She did not sleep well, but she slept. She checked in on her dead man's switch before she turned off the light, the way other people check the door lock. Normal, necessary, already routine. The meeting place was a rented conference room in a mid-rise office building downtown. Not his territory, not hers. Neutral in the way a coin is neutral, it can fall either way. He came alone. She knew from everything Kwame had told her that this was unusual. She also knew that arriving alone was a deliberate signal, and she appreciated signals she could read clearly. She got there 5 minutes early and was already seated when he walked in. He sat down across from her without any preamble and placed both hands flat on the table. He started asking questions. Clean, precise questions about the Greystone structure, the 7 companies, the 23-day cycle, the specific transaction patterns she had documented. The questions were so accurate that within 2 minutes, Sonia understood something important. He already knew what she had found. He was not trying to learn what she knew. He was trying to learn how much she understood about what it meant. She interrupted him mid-question. "You already know what I found," she said. "You're not asking what it is. You're asking how much I understand about what it means." He stopped talking. He looked at her. Not a threat in that look. Not calculation exactly. More like recalibration. Like someone updating a file in real time. "Yes," he said. "That is correct." "Then let me save us both some time," she said. "I understand enough to be useful to whoever I decide to hand this to. And I have arranged things so that what I understand does not disappear with me, regardless of what happens in this room." A long silence. He said, "Dead man's switch. You know what that is. I know what that is. Then you know that threatening me doesn't solve your problem. It creates a larger one." He said, "I'm not here to threaten you." She said, "I know. If you were, you would have used the 2 men in the parking garage. You wouldn't have sent a card." He looked at her the way she had already noticed. He looked at things he found unexpected, with a particular quality of attention, like someone who rarely needs to look twice, and is looking twice. He made his offer clearly and without decoration. 60 days of silence on Greystone. In exchange, he would dismantle the structure properly. No workers harmed, no jobs lost. The financial architecture dissolved cleanly. After 60 days, she would receive complete documentation of everything, and she could do whatever she wanted with it. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Why 60 days?" He said, "Because I need time to do it right." She said, "That's not a reason. That's a timeline." "I need the reason." He looked at her. This was a question he did not want to answer, because the true answer meant admitting things he had not said out loud to anyone. He found the answer closest to the truth. "Because I am in the middle of a transition," he said, "and things that need to be closed properly require time." She heard the space after that sentence. Her job was reading the gaps between numbers, and this was a gap she could feel even without a spreadsheet. "You are stepping down," she said. Not a question. He did not deny it. She said, "Is the transition planned? Or is something forcing it?" That was the sharper question. He met it with a pause that told her something. "The transition is planned," he said. "The 6 DDGs fall within the window, where I still have full authority. After that, this will either be closed correctly, or it will belong to someone else to inherit with clean documentation either way." She heard what he did not say. She filed it. "I have a counter condition," she said. "Go ahead. I will stay quiet, but you provide me with documentation of progress every 2 weeks, not your word. Documents. If the progress falls short at any checkpoint, I report early, no negotiation. You are auditing the process," he said. "I am auditing the process. You are not the subject. The dismantlement is the subject." For the first time in the meeting, something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. The expression of a man who has just heard something he finds genuinely unexpected and finds it more interesting than he anticipated. "Agreed," he said. "One more condition," she said. "Go ahead. If anything happens to me during these 60 days, anything that looks like an accident, my dead man switch activates immediately, not in 72 hours, immediately. I will reconfigure it tonight." He said, "Nothing is going to happen to you." She said, "I know you believe that, but I need the system to not depend on your beliefs." A long pause. He looked at her. And in that pause, something happened that he would not have been able to explain, and did not try to explain to himself until much later. He looked at her and thought, not consciously, not in words, but in the particular way the body sometimes knows things before the mind catches up, that there was something familiar in the way she insisted on systems she could trust, in the way she did not take his word for anything, while also, clearly, not being afraid of him. In the complete absence of performance in how she sat in this room and handled this conversation. It was a way of being in the world that he had seen before, that he had loved before, in someone he had not allowed himself to think about clearly in a very long time. He said, "Agreed." They did not shake hands. This was not that kind of agreement. It was the kind that holds because both sides understand the consequences of breaking it, and that is sometimes the sturdier foundation. She drove home in the evening and looked at herself in the rearview mirror at a red light. She said to her own reflection, "You just made a deal with someone you know nothing about except that an entire parking garage listened when he said one word. Smart, Sonia." She waited. Then she said, "But he came with a card, not a gun. He sat across from you without backup, and when you said the switch activates immediately, he accepted it without argument. A man who wanted to eliminate you would not accept a clause like that." She pulled forward when the light changed. "Still," she said, "be careful." In the back seat of his car across town, Marcus was holding a small notepad from his inside jacket pocket. He wrote two things. The first, SC, independent, thorough, prepared, not afraid. Why? The second, after a pause, Leon said he would handle it. What exactly did he handle? He put the notepad away. The question sat in the back of his mind for the rest of the evening like something he had set down in a place he would not forget. 2 weeks passed. On a Monday morning, Sonia received an encrypted email. No greeting, no explanation. Just a PDF package containing the first progress report on the Greystone dismantlement, accurate, specific, delivered on the agreed date. She reviewed it for 90 minutes. Everything checked out. And there was one thing she had not expected to find. He was not simply closing the subsidiary companies. He was transferring assets back to the workers, converting the shell structures into worker-owned cooperatives with actual operating licenses, actual employment agreements, actual futures. She sent a reply. Short, professional, received, first batch verified. 3 items for follow-up in the next delivery. Timestamps on the transaction records need to match wire transfer logs. Otherwise, clean. Marcus read the message in his office. He read the last 2 words twice. Otherwise, clean. Leon was standing near the window. He said, "She is going to be a problem." Marcus said, "An auditor doing her job accurately is not a problem. It is a control mechanism." Leon did not respond. He waited for Marcus to say something else. Marcus had gone back to reading. Leon left. In the elevator going back to his own floor, he took out his phone and opened a list he kept separately from everything else. He added the name Sonia Cross to it. He did not label the list. He did not need to. The next week, Sonia found a technical error in the second batch of documentation Marcus sent. Not fraud. Not illegal. A small procedural inconsistency in how certain transfers were recorded, the kind of thing that looked fine now, but would create complications during any future legal review if it was not corrected. Her agreement with Marcus did not require her to flag this. She was there to verify progress, not to fix his paperwork. She called him anyway, because she could not look at something broken and leave it broken. It was not in her. He answered on the second ring. She said, "There is a technical issue in the second batch, not a compliance violation. A procedural gap that will cause problems if it is not corrected before the next round of filings. I think we should meet." He said, "When?" She named a coffee shop. She chose it neutral, public, unremarkable. He should, "Tomorrow morning." She said 10 o'clock. She was there first again. He arrived at 10:02, alone, the same as before. She laid the technical issue out clearly in about 8 minutes. He asked 3 questions. 2 of the questions were specific enough that she had to think for 4 or 5 seconds before answering. He understood numbers. She had known people who ran large financial operations who did not actually understand the numbers underneath. He was not one of those people. He ordered coffee from the counter himself while she was still setting up her notes. Coffee from the shop's ceramic mug, not the personal water bottle. This was the first time she had seen him drink from anything other than his own container. She noticed it the way she noticed everything quietly, without reacting, and filed it away. At one point during the conversation, Marcus was turning something between his fingers on the table. A small folded piece of paper, old, creased from many foldings, the size of something that had lived in a jacket pocket for a long time. He was doing it the way other people click a pen, without thinking about it. When he noticed Sonia's eyes move toward it, he stopped and placed it flat on the table. She did not ask about it. At the end of the meeting, he stood up and reached for his jacket. The morning was cool enough that he had carried it over his arm coming in. He shook it out and started putting it on. His left hand trembled enough that the third button would not catch on the first try. He waited, tried again. The button caught. Sonia had been collecting her papers. She continued collecting her papers. She did not look away. She also did not look at his hand with any expression at all. She just continued doing what she was doing, at the same pace, as though the 8 seconds that just happened were not any different from the 8 seconds before them. He finished with the jacket. He picked up the folded paper from the table and put it back in his inside pocket. She stood up and they walked out together. On the sidewalk, they went in opposite directions. She did not know what he was thinking. He did not tell her. What he was thinking was this. In 20 years of running things, the people around him had responded to the tremor in one of 2 ways. Either they pretended they had not seen it, which always had the particular texture of pity trying to disguise itself, or they reacted with concern that he had not asked for and could not use. She had done neither of those things. She had done the third thing, the thing almost nobody did, which was simply nothing. She had seen it and not needed him to do anything about it. She had not required him to manage her reaction on top of everything else. He did not have a word for how that felt. He just knew it had been a long time since someone had made him feel comfortable in a moment when he normally felt exposed. He walked to his car thinking about her and told himself it was because she was relevant to the situation. She was relevant to the situation. It was not only that. That same week, in her clinic after hours, Grace Ellison laid 4 sets of test results on her desk and compared them side to side. Grace was 45. She wore small wire-rimmed glasses and kept a physical notebook for patient observations she did not want in any electronic system. She had been Marcus's private physician for 6 years. She had first diagnosed the neurological condition 8 months ago. She had been watching the progression carefully since then, and for the last 3 months, something had been wrong with what she was watching. Months 1 through 4. The progression matched the expected parameters. Slow, consistent, predictable. The kind of progression that gives you time to plan. Months 5 through 8. The progression was running at approximately 1.8 times the expected rate, not a sudden spikes. A sudden spike, a steady acceleration, the kind that could be mistaken for natural variation in a disease with a variable course. But Grace had followed enough clinical cases to know. This specific condition did not accelerate this way this early, not naturally. She set down the charts. She picked up her notebook and wrote, "Progression anomaly. Begin independent verification." She called Marcus that afternoon. He answered on the third ring. She said, "I need you to come in this week. Your recent numbers are concerning." He said, "I will call you back." He did not call back. Grace sat at her desk, looking at the charts for a while longer. Then she got up, locked the clinic, and drove home. She would need to run additional tests. She would need to do it carefully and without alarming anyone. She would need time. She had 3 months of suspicion. Now she needed evidence. That same night, Leon was on a call he took outside, in the parking structure beneath his building. The other voice said, "The auditor's progress reporting is continuing." Vale met with her again, alone. Leon said, "I know." The voice said, "He doesn't do that." Leon said, "No, he doesn't." A pause. The voice said, "Is that a problem?" Leon thought about the question for a moment. What he thought but did not say out loud was this. Yes, it was a problem, but not the kind of problem the voice on the other end was thinking about. It was a problem because it was the first time in 15 years that Leon had watched Marcus choose to meet with a woman alone, choose to see her again. Choose, and that was the word that mattered, choose to engage. What Leon had protected for 15 years was starting to move. Leon said, "Increase coverage. I want to know every contact between them." He ended the call and stood in the parking structure for a while. Above him, the city hummed. Somewhere in it, Marcus Vale was making decisions that Leon had not authorized, that had not happened in a very long time. And in the part of Leon that would never quite be honest with himself about its own motivations, something was beginning to tighten. Day 19 of the deal, a man named Garrett Holt arrived at Sonia's office at 2 in the afternoon. He introduced himself as representing a consortium of industrial stakeholders. He wore a suit that cost more than Sonia's monthly retainer from Greystone, and he carried a briefcase that was more statement than necessity. He knew about the deal. Not in general terms, specifically. The 60-day timeline. The documentation exchange structure. The fact that she had found something significant and was holding it. He placed a number on the table. $180,000. To file her report immediately. Everything she had, right now, no waiting. Sonia listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You know about a private arrangement between me and another party." Garrett said, "We know you found something significant. This is fair compensation for completing your work." "Stop!" she said. Not loudly, just clearly. "The fact that you know about the arrangement means one of two things. You have a source close to the other party, or you have a source close to me. In either case, this conversation is over." Garrett started to say something else. She opened the office door and said, "I recommend you have a productive afternoon." He left. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment. Then she walked to her desk and opened her notebook. She wrote, "Garrett Holt, Consortium. They know about the deal. Source is on Vale's side or mine. Quam has not broken, which means someone is in Vale's inner circle." She underlined the last line. 2 hours later, her phone rang. Marcus. Before she could call him. He said, "He came to your office this morning, not a question." She said, "You are watching me." He said, "I am watching everyone who knows what you know. That is operational, not personal." She said, "Did you know they would approach me?" He said, "No." A pause, then quieter, which means someone told them. "And the only people who knew about our arrangement," she said, "are you and whoever you told." A long silence. He said, "I did not tell anyone." She listened to the way he said it, not defensive, not rushing to get the denial out. Heavy? The way a sentence is heavy when the person saying it is in the process of recognizing something they have been trying not to recognize for a while. She said, "I believe you." He said, "That is generous." She said, "It is logical. If you had told someone to send Garrett Holt to my office, you would not be calling to warn me about Garrett Holt." She heard him breathe in, out, the sound of someone sitting with something uncomfortable. "Who knew?" she said. "Just you." "And Leon," he said, "I will look into it." She said, "There is one other thing." Holt's information was specific. He knew the 60-day window. He knew the documentation exchange structure. He did not know about my dead man's switch. Whatever source he has, it has access to the basics of our deal, but not to what I built before we met. Marcus was quiet for a moment. She could almost hear him working through the implications. He said, "Thank you for telling me that. That narrows things considerably." She said, "Marcus," his first name. She had used the formal address until now. This was the first time she used his name. He noticed. She heard the brief pause. That meant he had noticed. He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you okay?" The question was simple, genuine. She was not asking about the leak or the deal or Greystone. She was asking because she had heard something in his voice over the course of the last few minutes, Zinit, that she could not name but recognized. Something underneath the precision and the flatness that sounded like a man carrying a weight that nobody around him had been allowed to know about. He did not answer immediately. 15 seconds passed. She counted them. He said, "Call me if they approach you again." The call ended. She looked at her phone for a moment. Then she wrote in her notebook, "A person who cannot answer the question, 'Are you okay?' is usually the one who most needs to be asked." She put the notebook away and went back to work. Marcus sat at his desk after the call ended and looked at the water bottle on his desk for a long time. Then he took out his personal notepad and wrote a single name. He wrote it and looked at it. He wrote it in the same deliberate way that someone writes something down when they need to make it real by putting it outside their own head. Leon. He put the notepad back in his pocket. He called his personal assistant and said, "Find me a time on the calendar that is not in the system. Private, no record." He needed to test something. He needed to test it in the way that a person tests something when they already suspect the result. And the testing is not really about learning the answer, it is about being able to say, when the moment comes, that they did not act on suspicion alone. That evening, in a meeting with Leon that covered routine logistics, Marcus inserted a single piece of false information. A specific detail about the Greystone transfer timeline, a false address, a false date, a fabricated figure. He delivered it conversationally, the way you might mention a scheduling update. He said it once. He did not repeat it. He moved on. He told himself, if this information surfaces anywhere else in the next 72 hours, the source is unambiguous. He went home and watched the clock. 48 hours later, the false information had surfaced. Garrett Holt's group had it. They had used it to adjust their approach to Sonia's timeline. Marcus sat alone in his office with this result and did not move for a long time. He had run an intelligence operation for 20 years on the principle that you confirm before you conclude. He had run hundreds of tests exactly like this one. He had always been willing to be wrong. He had always been willing to discover that his suspicion was misplaced and that the person he had doubted was actually trustworthy, and he owed them a private apology and a recalibration. This time he was not wrong. Leon. 20 years. His right hand. The person who sat in every important meeting. The person who placed the water bottle on his desk twice a day, every day, without fail. He sat with the result and did not allow himself to react before he had fully absorbed what he was reacting to. This was something he had trained himself to do a long time ago, to let the information land completely before deciding what to do with it. Emotion was the enemy of clarity. He could not afford to be unclear right now. He would need to move carefully, and he would need to know more before he could act. The lab results came back on a Thursday morning. Grace had sent the samples under a false name to an independent laboratory in Ann Arbor 3 weeks earlier. She had given no context, just the samples and a request for a full toxicological panel, including compounds not covered by standard screening. The report was 12 pages. She read all 12 pages in her car in the parking lot of her clinic before she went inside. On page 7 in the supplemental findings section, there was a compound she had to look up. It was not in standard reference texts. She found it in a specialized neuropharmacology journal from 4 years earlier, in a study about synthetic neurotoxins and their interaction with pre-existing neurological conditions. The compound was synthetic. It was not something available commercially. Someone had either manufactured it with knowledge of advanced organic chemistry or had access to a source that did. The doses were not large enough to cause acute toxicity. They were, however, exactly large enough to, when introduced repeatedly over a period of months, significantly accelerate the progression of a degenerative neurological condition in a patient who already had one. She sat in her car for 37 minutes. Then she started her car and drove to Marcus's building. She arrived without an appointment. His assistant started to explain to Pian that he was in a meeting. Grace said, "Tell him Dr. Ellison is here. He will come out." Marcus came out in 90 seconds. He looked at her face and understood immediately that this was not a routine visit. They went to a private room. Grace closed the door. She put a folder on the table. She said, "Read this before I say anything." He read. He read slowly, particularly slowly on page 7. He read that page twice. Then he set the folder down. He looked out the window. He did not speak for a full minute. Then he said, "How long?" not asking how much time he had left. She registered the distinction immediately, asking how long he had been poisoned. She said, "Based on the concentration levels in the samples, 6 to 8 months. Possibly longer if the exposure began at lower doses that have since been increased," he said. "You said the compound requires medical knowledge," she said. "Advanced medical knowledge, or access to someone with that level of knowledge. This is not something available in a pharmacy. This is not something a person finds by searching the internet. Someone knew exactly what they were doing and exactly why." He looked down at his left hand. The familiar tremor was there, as it was every afternoon. He placed his right hand over it, but this was different from the way he usually covered it. This was not concealment. This was a man steadying himself. She said, "Marcus, are you hearing me?" He said, "I hear you." She said, "The compound is not the underlying condition. The underlying condition is real. But without the compound, the progression rate should have been much slower. The calculations I made 8 months ago, the timeline I gave you, those were based on what I assumed was natural progression." He said, "And the actual timeline?" She said, "Without the compound continuing, and with the treatment I can now design specifically for what this is your functional window is longer than I told you. Significantly longer." He said, "How much longer?" She said, "I do not want to give you another number until I have had time to model it properly. But I am not talking about months. I am talking about years." He sat with that. Years instead of months. A different arithmetic entirely. He said, "Thank you, Grace." She said, "Do you know who?" He said, "I need to handle this carefully. Please do not speak to anyone about this report or the samples until I come back to you." She said, "Marcus, please." She looked at him for a long moment. She was not satisfied with the answer. But she had known Marcus for 6 years, and she knew when he was asking for time and when he was asking to be left alone, and this was time. She picked up her copy of the report, left the original on the table, and left. Marcus alone. He sat at his desk. He put the lab report in his inside jacket pocket. He took out the folded piece of paper from that same pocket, the one that had been there for a long time, and he held it without opening it. Just held it. He looked at the faded handwriting on the outside, the single letter at the end of a sentence he kept private. "D," he said quietly to the empty room. Who has been beside me for 20 years, and who would lose the most when I step down? He set the paper flat on his desk. He picked up the water bottle that Leon had placed there that morning, and he moved it to the floor, far from his hand. He looked at it down there. Then he looked at his left hand. The tremor had come back, light and steady, the way it did in the afternoons. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He took out a different notepad, one with no identifying marks, bought from a store he had visited exactly once. He wrote a name. Then he wrote below it, "Do not move until you are certain you have been here before." He had been, in fact. He had been in the position of suspecting someone close and being wrong, and the damage from acting wrong was always worse than the damage from waiting. He needed certainty. He already had strong suspicion. He needed the kind of evidence that would hold regardless of what Leon said when confronted. He made 2 phone calls that afternoon. Neither of them went through Leon. He called his private attorney, the one whose existence Leon did not know about. He called Grace back to say she could begin researching treatment options, but should share nothing with anyone. That evening, doing everything normally, the end-of-day briefing, the signatures, the schedule review, he was Leon's Marcus, completely. The version that trusted without question. He was very good at that version. He had been practicing it for 20 years. What was different now was that he was practicing it knowingly, for the first time, to buy himself the days he needed to do what came next correctly. Leon realized the information trap in the small hours of the morning. He had been going through a back-channel report and he found the detail that was wrong, the false address, the fabricated figure. He recognized it as planted. It took him longer than Marcus had calculated, but he recognized it. He sat at his desk at 2:30 in the morning and looked at the confirmation of what that meant. Marcus had tested him. Marcus suspected him. He went through 4 stages in about 30 minutes. The stages showed on his face in the empty room, even though there was no one to see them. Denial. Calculation. Something that might have been called fear, if Leon had been the kind of who named his emotions. Decision. If Marcus was investigating, he needed to create enough chaos fast enough to redirect that investigation before it reached the conclusion Marcus was clearly moving toward. He needed something urgent, something that would consume Marcus's full attention and resources. He needed to use Sonia Cross, not to hurt her. He was clear with himself about that, or as clear as he permitted himself to be. He reached out to Garrett Holt's group, not to buy her anymore, to increase the pressure enough that she filed immediately, creating a public situation around Greystone that would force Marcus into crisis management mode. He told himself this was the only option he had left. He told himself this carefully and with a great deal of focus, the way a person focuses on a thing when they need not to look at the thing beside it. 3 days later, Sonia called Marcus at 9 in the evening. Her voice was level. He had learned over the previous weeks that Sonia Cross's voice was level in roughly the same proportion as the situation was not. When things were fine, she was direct and casual. When things were serious, her voice became extremely precise and completely controlled. Tonight, her voice was precise and completely controlled. She said, "The situation has changed. Someone has been following me every day for the last 3 days. This is not occasional observation. They know when I leave, where I go, when I come back. This is preparation. Our deal assumed I would remain safe. I am not," he said. "Where are you right now?" She said. "Why does that matter?" He said, "Because I am going to come get you, and I would like to know which direction to drive." A short pause. She said, "You do not have to." He said, "I know I don't have to. Where are you?" She looked around her apartment. Then she gave him the address. A safe apartment, the kind Marcus kept in 3 different neighborhoods in the city, each in a building where the management did not ask questions, and the other tenants had learned not to notice things. He arrived 20 minutes after she did. No security personnel in the building that night, just the 2 of them. They sat at the kitchen table. She had found coffee in the cabinet and made it without asking. He had looked at the coffee and made himself a glass of water from the tap. The first time she had seen him drink tap water. She noted it and said nothing. They worked through the situation for about 40 minutes. He proposed accelerating the Greystone timeline, compressing 3 remaining weeks into 10 days. She analyzed the risks of compression, specifically 2 procedural gaps that would become complications if they rushed them. He listened and adjusted the plan. Then, mid sentence, while explaining a logistics step, his left hand knocked the water glass off the table. The sound of glass on tile, water spreading across the floor. Silence. He looked at his hand. He did not hide it. He did not move it. He just looked at it. She stood up, got a kitchen towel from the counter, and cleaned up the water. Then she sat back down and looked at him. She said, "How long have you had that?" He said, "8 months." "Officially." She said, "Unofficially?" He said, "Unofficially. I think someone helped it along." This was the first time he had said this to anyone, not to Grace, not to a lawyer, not in a room alone with himself. For 8 months, he had carried this particular thought, the suspicion underneath the diagnosis, in a place so internal that it had not been a sentence yet, just a weight with a shape. She said, "Have you confirmed it?" He said, "Yesterday." She said, "Who?" He looked at the table. "I have a suspicion I do not want to have," she said. "That is the hardest kind." He said, "Yes." She let the quiet sit for a moment. She did not fill it with reassurance. She did not ask the next question. She just let the silence be what it was, which was a space where something very heavy had just been set down. She said, "You don't have to tell me." He said, "I know." Another pause. He said, "Leon, 20 years. My right hand." He looked at the table. Not devastated, not performing devastation. Just a man who has finally said out loud the thing that has been living in the part of him that does not make sentences. She said, "The hardest evidence to accept is the evidence that proves someone you trusted." He said, "Yes, exactly that." Later, around 12:30 in the morning, when the plan had been worked through and the immediate logistics settled, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them. He did not open it. He said, "There is something else, from 15 years ago. I think it is connected to what is happening now. I am not ready to tell you all of it, but I want you to know that it exists." She looked at the piece of paper. She looked at him. She did not ask. She said,
Okay. He said, okay.
She said, "When you are ready, I am not going anywhere tonight." He looked at her for a moment. That word, okay, was not someone smoothing over a difficult moment.
It was someone who understood without requiring an explanation that not everything needs to be spoken the same night it becomes real. He picked up the paper, put it back in his pocket. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable.
The next morning, Sonia was at the kitchen table, reviewing the Greystone documents. Marcus was working at the desk in the living room. They had been in the same space for almost an hour, 2 people who had gotten used to being in the same space, working in the particular quiet of people who did not need to fill the air between them. She was going through a physical folder, looking for a specific document. She lifted the folder to angle it toward the light, and a loose piece of paper slid out from between 2 sections and fell to the floor. She picked it up. It was a photograph, printed, not digital, old enough that the color had begun to shift slightly. 4 by 6 inches. A woman photographed from a distance. Candidly, she was turned toward a window, unaware of the camera, caught in the middle of the kind of thought that makes a face quiet. Sonia looked at the photograph. Something in the back of her mind moved. She looked at it for 5 seconds. Then the memory surfaced. Portland, fall of 2021. An audit engagement for a small distribution company. Pacific Ridge Logistics. 3 weeks. A woman on staff named Helen Marsh, quiet, precise, consistently ate lunch alone, and without fail, every single time Detroit came up in conversation, redirected the topic within 1 or 2 sentences. Sonia had noted this at the time and had not thought about it since. She noted behavioral patterns the way she noted numerical patterns, automatically, without judgment. Just, data point filed, relevance unknown, retained. The relevance was no longer unknown. The woman in the photograph and Helen Marsh had the same angle to their shoulders when they turned toward a window, the same way of holding stillness. She set the photograph on the table. She looked at Marcus. She said, "Who is this?" He glanced up. He looked at the photograph. He looked at her. He said, "Someone I knew a long time ago." She said, "Is she still alive?" He said, "No." She said, "Are you certain?" The way she asked it, not doubtful, not challenging, but with the specific precision of someone running a verification check, made him stop completely. He said, "Why are you asking it that way?" She said, "Because I think I have seen her." She told it slowly. In order: Portland, Autumn 2021, Pacific Ridge Logistics, Helen Marsh, 3 weeks of professional interaction. She remembered her for 2 specific reasons. She never ate with colleagues, and she had a consistent and practiced redirect for the topic of Detroit. Sonia said, "She is alive." Or she was 3 years ago. And she was hiding from something that originated in Detroit. Marcus did not move. The silence that followed was long. This was not the silence of a man who did not know what to say. This was the silence of a man rebuilding the architecture of 15 years from the foundation up. He thought about what Leon had told him. He thought about the specific words. There was an accident. Out of state. I verified it myself, Marcus. I am sorry. Had not asked how. He had been in grief and he had trusted the man who had been beside him for years, and he had not asked how. He said quietly, "She is alive." Not a question then. And Leon knew. He called Leon into the office that afternoon. He gave no reason. His voice was the same as on any other afternoon. Leon noticed nothing unusual. He came in, sat in the chair across from the desk, and waited. Marcus placed the lab report on the desk. He did not speak. Leon looked at the report. His face was still for 2 seconds. Then he sat down. He was already sitting, but he seemed to settle further, the way a person settles when the legs stop doing the work of holding the body up with confidence. Marcus said, "Would you like to explain this? Or should I?" Leon said, "I never wanted to hurt you." Marcus said, "Then explain to me what this is." Leon did not deny it. He did not deflect. He started to talk, and what came out was not a defense. It was something closer to a confession, the kind that comes when a person has been holding something for so long that the act of holding it has become indistinguishable from the act of being held by it. He said he had known about the step down. He had used the succession framework that Marcus had been developing. He had seen names on lists, structures being assembled, preparations being made. His own name was not in any of it. He said, "I built this alongside you. I was here before you had any of this. I kept things standing when you wanted to walk away, and you were going to hand everything to people who have never sat in a difficult room with you and give me a pension and a handshake." Marcus said, "I was going to." Leon said, "I know what you were going to do. I know it was fair. I know it made sense. I also know I could not accept it." A silence. Marcus said, "Diane is alive." That sentence cut through everything, the confession, the justification, the 20 years of history in the room. All of it went quiet under those 3 words. Leon did not speak. Marcus said, "She was alive, and you told me she was dead. You arranged for her to leave, and then you told me she was gone. You sat beside me for 15 years and watched me live with that. Help me understand, Leon. Because 20 years of knowing you, and there is nothing in 20 years that makes this make sense." Leon looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Because if she stayed, you would have had everything. Her, the organization, a complete life. And you would not have needed me the same way anymore." The longest silence in the story so far. Then Leon said, "I know how that sounds." Marcus said, "You took 15 years. From me. From her. From whatever we could have been for each other. Because you could not accept the possibility of me not needing you." Leon said, "I know." Marcus said, "You do not know. If you knew, you would not have done it." Leon started to say his name. Marcus said, "Leon." His voice did not rise. "Leave my office. Do not go to your desk. Do not contact anyone in this organization. You will hear from my attorney tomorrow." Leon stood up. He looked at Marcus one final time, looking for something. Whatever it was no longer there. He left. Marcus called Sonia. One sentence, he said, "It was Leon. All of it, including Diane." She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "No, but I will be." She heard the difference. Okay is a current state. Will be is a direction. She said, "What do you need right now?" He said, "Nothing. Thank you for telling me about Portland." She said, "I did not know it would lead here." He said, "Nobody ever does. That is exactly why it matters." He ended the call. He sat alone in his office. He did not have a plan for the next 5 minutes. For the first time in a long time, he just let that be true. The following morning, Marcus sat across from his private attorney, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Voss, who had represented him in matters that did not go through Leon for 7 years. She said, "We can handle this quietly. Keep it in-house." He said no. She said, "Marcus, if this goes through the legal system, there will be attention." He said, "There will be attention either way. This goes through proper channels." She looked at him. She said, "That is not typically how you," he said. "I know how I have typically handled things. I have been handling things internally for 20 years. That is part of why this was possible. A man cannot be what Leon was for that long in an organization that resolves everything quietly. That environment made him. I am not going to use the same environment to clean it up." A pause. "You built your life on the belief that you were protecting me," he said. Not to Margaret, to himself, or to the absent version of Leon. "The most honest thing I can do for you now is make sure you face the real consequences of what that protection looked like." Margaret made notes. Leon would face criminal charges. Poisoning. The evidence was documented. The chain was clean. It would go where it was supposed to go. Marcus left at her office. He walked to his car. He sat in it for a moment before starting it. He had spent 20 years solving problems privately, efficiently, without public record. It had seemed like strength. What it had actually been was the question of a space where certain things could happen without anyone outside seeing them. He was not going to pretend otherwise. 2 days later, Grace called him. She had run the models. She had consulted with a colleague at a university hospital in Chicago, anonymously. She had the new numbers. She said, "Without the compound continuing and with the treatment protocol I am recommending, you are looking at 3 to 5 years of strong functional capacity, possibly more, depending on response." He said, 3 to 5 years. She said minimum. It is not a cure. The underlying condition is real and it is progressive. But it is not what I told you 8 months ago. He said, 8 months ago you told me roughly 18 months. She said, I know. He said, I have been winding down a transition that did not need to be rushed. She said, you made decisions based on the best information you had. The information was corrupted. That is not your failure. He looked out the window. He said, no, but it is a lesson. She said, which lesson? He said, never let a single source be the only source for something that changes everything. 1 week later, his apartment, evening. He had confirmed Diane's address through a private investigator with no connection to anyone he knew professionally. She was still in Portland, still Helen Marsh, still living the quiet life she had constructed. He sat with a blank sheet of paper and a pen for 20 minutes before he wrote anything. The letter was short, handwritten. It said, I know you are alive. I know why you left, or enough of it anyway. I am not writing to ask for anything or bleidertiden. I just needed you to know that I know. Take care of yourself. Not I love you. Not please come back. No demands. No timeline. Just the truth sent forward without asking anything from it. He mailed it through ordinary post. The return address was a P.O. box with no name. That same evening, in the safe apartment that was still available, because the situation was still not entirely resolved, Sonja was packing up the last of the Greystone working documents. The deadline was 3 days away, and everything was on track. She had been here long enough that the kitchen was familiar, and the particular quality of the light in the afternoon had stopped being the light of a temporary place. Marcus came by with the final documentation batch. He set it on the table, and she reviewed it while he made coffee. They had gotten very comfortable around a kitchen that belonged to neither of them. She said, looking at the papers, you are going to be okay. Not a question, he said, medically, Grace thinks so. Everything else. He looked at the folded piece of paper on the table. Open now, for the first time. The old address crossed out. A new phone number in its place, written instantly. I spent 15 years building a wall around something I thought I had lost. Turns out the wall was the problem, not the loss. She listened. He said, what do you do when the story you told yourself to survive turns out to be wrong? He was not asking her to solve it. He was asking it the way a person asks a question they have been carrying for a long time. Because saying it out loud to someone who is actually listening is different from saying it to the dark. She thought before she answered. She said, "You tell a different story, and you give yourself time to believe it. There is no shortcut." He said, "How do you know that?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I have been doing it for 5 years." She told him about 2019, the medical corporation audit, the report that was accurate about the numbers and wrong about the human consequences. The man who lost his job, his house, his family, because his name was prominent in documentation she prepared, not the mastermind. Just the one who had signed what he was told to sign. She said, "I was right about the numbers. I was wrong about the consequences. And I have spent 5 years building a different way of working, not just what I find, but what happens to the people around what I find." He said, "And that helps." She said, "It does not undo what happened, but it means every audit I have done since is better than the one that hurt someone. That has to be enough." He looked at her for a moment. This was the first time she had given him the context she came from. Not to earn sympathy, just as information. "This is where I came from. This is why I do things the way I do them." He said, "That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 15 years." She said, "It is not advice. It is just what I found." He said, "Sometimes that is worth more." They sat for a while in a quiet that had nothing strained in it. Day 60. The final documentation package from Marcus arrived at 8 in the morning. Complete, accurate, clean. Everything he had promised, in the format agreed upon, on the agreed date. Sonia spent 2 hours reviewing it. She found no issues. She called him. She said, "The materials are in order. Our deal is complete." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am keeping the documentation." He said, "I know." She said, "That means this could go somewhere, further down the line, depending on what happens." He said, "I know that too." A pause. "You held your side. I held mine. What you do with the information after that is yours." She said, "You are okay with that." He said, "A deal is a deal, Sonia." She heard how he said her name, not formal, not distant, the name of someone he actually knew. She said, "Take care of yourself, Marcus." He said, "You too." The call ended. She went to her office that afternoon and packed up the Greystone files. A colleague called to ask about the next project. She talked through the logistics. Normal. Professional. Life continuing in its own way. Before she sealed the last box, she found a small piece of paper that had been tucked into the back cover of one of the Greystone folders. The email address from his first contact. Plain text on plain paper. She looked at it. She was not going to pretend to herself that the last 60 days had been ordinary. That was not the kind of person she was. Things had happened. She had been in danger, and she had been steady. She had been in a kitchen at midnight, and she had been honest. She had recognized a photograph and changed the trajectory of something that had been wrong for a long time. The email address was on a piece of paper in her hand. She opened the left drawer of her desk, the drawer she used for things she had not decided about yet. She put the paper in. She closed the drawer. She did not lock it. 4 weeks later, 11:30 at night, Marcus was in his office working late. An old habit. The building was mostly quiet. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Area code 5E3, Oregon. He looked at screen through 3 rings. He answered the audience does not hear the other voice. They hear Marcus, he said. "I know." A long pause. "Yes, I know." Leon, another pause, the sound of listening. "I know now. I did not then. I should have looked harder." More listening. His face changed with each second, not the sudden relief of a dramatic reunion. Something slower than that. The way light changes when morning has been coming for a while, and you have been awake long enough to watch it. "I am not asking you to come back. I am not asking anything." A pause. Quieter. "I am glad you called." More listening. He nodded once. He said, "Yes, whenever you are ready, or never, if that is what you choose." Either is. He did not finish the sentence. Either is okay. He ended the call. He sat alone. He looked at his left hand resting on the desk. The tremor was there, as it was most evenings. Light, steady. The thing that had been telling him something was wrong for 8 months before he had the full truth to pair it with. He did not put his right hand over it this time. He left it where it was. He looked at it not with the focused attention of someone reading data. He looked at it the way you look at something you are learning to live with, and in the looking, discovering that the thing you cannot change is not the whole story. It is a part of the story, and the story has more in it than that part. He reached into his inside jacket pocket. He took out the folded piece of paper. He opened it. The old address was crossed out. The new phone number was there in its place, written a few weeks ago, when he first confirmed she was still in Portland, before he knew she would call. He looked at the number. He folded the paper back, slowly, along its existing creases. He put it back in his pocket, close to his chest, where it had always been. He turned off the desk lamp. He sat in the dark for a minute, looking out at Detroit. Then he got up, put on his jacket, and went home. 6 weeks later, 3 scenes. No narrator needed. First scene, Sonia's office. Tuesday morning, an email arrives. The display name is empty. The from field shows the initials MV. Inside is a financial report on a manufacturing company in Indiana. No introduction, no explanation. Just a single line at the bottom of the email. Thought you might find the Q4 numbers interesting. She opens the attachment. She reads the Q4 section. She pauses. She reaches for her pen. She opens a new notebook page. She does not reply immediately. She works first. The audience understands everything without being told anything. This is two people who have found a way to keep knowing each other in the language of who they actually are. Not roses and declarations, numbers and a single line. Exactly right. Second scene, Grace's clinic waiting room. The same Tuesday morning. Marcus is sitting in a chair along the wall. He arrived at his appointment time. He has not canceled. He has no laptop open, no phone in his hand, nothing to project availability or importance. He is just sitting, the way any patient sits, waiting for his name to be called. He is holding the folded piece of paper. He opens it, looks at the phone number, the new one, the Oregon one, for a moment. Then he folds it closed. He tucks it back into his inside pocket, against his chest. He looks out the waiting room window. The trees in the hospital courtyard are changing color. He watches them for a while. A nurse opens the inner door and calls his name. He stands up. He goes in. Third scene. A law office waiting room. Same Tuesday morning. Leon sits in a row of chairs among people he has never met. He is dressed plainly. His silver hair is less precise than usual. He looks like the kind of man you would not notice, which is nothing like how he has spent the last 20 years. He looks down at his hands. The hands that placed a water bottle on a desk twice a day for 20 years. The hands that believed, with complete sincerity, that everything they did was for the right reason. No music tells you how to feel about this. No camera angle passes judgment. Just the truth of a man sitting alone with what his choices became, which is the most honest thing a story can show. The narrator comes back one last time. Quiet. The voice of someone who has stayed after everything else is over. He spent 20 years being the most informed person in any room. He had access to numbers, surveillance reports, sources, and documentation. More information than most people see in a lifetime. He built everything on the principle that if he knew more than everyone else, he could not be surprised. And yet, the most important things that he was being slowly poisoned, that the woman he had loved was alive. That the person he trusted most had been quietly dismantling both his health and his past for 8 months. None of those things came to him through his systems. They came through a woman who noticed a face in a photograph. Through a doctor who trusted what she was seeing over what she was told to expect. Through 8 months of his own body trying to tell him something was wrong. Information is not the same thing as truth. Information is what you collect. Truth is what finds you when the systems fail, and the people who care enough to notice the thing that does not fit decide to say something about it. The distance between those two things is exactly the size of the space where someone you trusted used to stand. And the question worth carrying with you, when you go back to your own rooms and your own people and your own carefully maintained certainties. Who in your life is telling the hard truths, and are you making it safe enough for them too? A breath. If something in this story stayed with you the moment he looked at that photograph and could not turn the page, or the kitchen at midnight when he finally said the name he had been carrying for 20 years, or the way she put that piece of paper in the drawer and did not lock it, I would love to hear which one. Drop a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us which moment landed. And if you want more stories that take people seriously, without easy answers and without shortcuts, we will be here. Subscribe if you like what you found. Take care of yourself. Good night. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
Before we close, I want to stay with you for just a few more minutes because this story was never really about a photograph. It was about something most of us do at some point in our lives, something we call moving on, but is actually something else entirely. Something closer to building a wall and calling it healing. Locking a door and telling ourselves we threw away the key because we chose to, not because we were afraid of what was behind it. Marcus Vail was one of the most powerful men in the room, in every room he entered. And for 15 years, that power gave him something very specific: the ability to not deal with the one thing that had broken him. He turned the pain into discipline. He turned the grief into control. And from the outside, it looked like strength. But strength and avoidance are not the same thing. They just wear the same suit. The first lesson this story carries is this: the wall you build around your wound does not protect you. It delays you. And while you are busy maintaining the wall, the wound is still there, still real, still waiting. Marcus did not heal. He postponed. And the cost of that postponement was 15 years. The second lesson is harder to sit with. The most dangerous betrayal does not come from your enemies. It comes from the person you stopped questioning because they were always there. Leon was not a monster. He was a man who loved without boundaries, who protected without asking permission, who confused ownership with loyalty. And that particular confusion is more common than any of us want to admit, in our friendships, in our families, in the people we rely on most. Love that cannot tolerate your independence is not love. It is possession with a gentler name. The third lesson belongs to Sonia. She was right about the numbers in 2019 and wrong about the consequences. And instead of using that to justify never caring about consequences again, she used it to care more carefully. That is what real accountability looks like. Not punishment, not guilt carried forever. The quiet, daily work of doing the next thing better. And the fourth lesson, the one that stays the longest, is about truth versus information. Marcus had more information than anyone around him. He had data and reports and sources and surveillance. What he did not have was the truth about the people closest to him. Because truth does not come through systems. It comes through people. People who notice what does not fit. People who say the hard thing even when it would be easier not to. People who ask, "Are you okay?" and actually mean it. The question worth taking with you today is simple. Who in your life is telling you the truth? And have you made it safe enough for them too? Because the most powerful room you will ever be in is not a boardroom. It is the room where someone who cares about you tells you something you did not want to hear, and you listen. That is where real strength lives.